Welcome to Class 19 for Hebrew 1 and 2, Bright Old Testament 502-504. Today we are going to cover our fifth Hebrew stem, having covered the Kal, the Nifal, the Piel, and the Pual. Today we will cover the Hiphil, so let's jump in. We have repeatedly stated throughout this class that the stereotype usages of each of the stem are just that, stereotype. So even though the Hiphil is usually called the causative stem, I've included this chart to show you that it has other purposes as well. These are the two forms of the Hiphil strong perfect verb. The more classic form is the heroic yod in between the second and third letter. However, when we add suffixes to the end of a Hiphil verb in the strong perfect, interesting things happen. In this case, the accent has been forced back one syllable, technically remaining on the same syllable rather than being drawn onto the ta at the end, since ta has a vowel ending with the comets rather than a consonantal ending. This has the accent then on the second root letter, which eliminates the heroic yod and instead has a patak. Now you may be looking at this and slightly panicked because that looks very similar to nifal, except a nifal starts with a nun. That's why it's called nifal. This is a Hiphil, so it starts with a he and a heroic. That's what sets it apart from the other strong perfect verbs in other stems. Here is the complete paradigm for the Hiphil strong perfect verb. Again, you will see two different forms, the heroic yod after the second root letter, and the patak under the second root letter. The heroic yod is found in the 3ms, but it's also found in the 3fs and the 3cp, because the lamed is needed to carry the vowel that is the suffix. In other forms of the verb, those that end in a consonant and a vowel, such as the 2ms and the 1cp, the accent has remained on the last syllable of the root, not the last syllable of the verb, but the last syllable of the root, and a patak is found underneath the second root letter. In other forms, the accent is on the final syllable of the word, such as the 2mp and the 2fp, and yet we still have a patak underneath the second root letter. In all of these, though, the giveaway is the he with the heroic. Here we have the Hiphil strong imperfect verb. You'll notice that the diagnostic for this verb is the patak underneath the preformative. This is different than any other form of the verb that we've seen so far. A Kal will typically have a heroic underneath the yod or a seirei. A nifal will have a heroic immediately followed by a comets. A Piel and a Pual both have a shva underneath the preformative. So this is a Hiphil because of the presence of the patak under the preformative in all of its forms. Typically there will be a heroic yod still after the second and third root letters, but occasionally that becomes a seirei, still a long E or I class vowel. But again, the giveaway of the Hiphil imperfect is the presence of the patak underneath the preformative letter. The Hiphil imperative is formed like other stems imperative, where the preformative of the imperfect is dropped. However, the Hiphil will also add a he on the beginning of the Hiphil imperative, still maintaining either the seirei or the heroic yod after the second root letter. Now you might be thinking this is too similar to the nifal imperative. However, you will remember that a nifal imperative has he plus heroic, plus a dagesh forte in the first root letter, plus a comets under the first root letter, whereas the Hiphil starts with a he with a patak. The infinitive absolute and infinitive construct in the Hiphil look very similar to the imperative. We have a he on the front with a patak, which again is the giveaway of the Hiphil in almost every inflection of this verb, and we still have either a seirei or a heroic yod. The only form that is close to this is the nifal, which also has a he preformative, but there we had, again, that comets under the first root letter and a dagesh forte in that first root letter. As you'll notice here in the Hiphil, there is no comets, and there also is no dagesh forte. What sets it apart, again, is the Hiphil with the patak. As with other stems of the Hebrew verb, the participle is formed by adding a mem prefix. Again, the vowel that goes under the mem prefix is the diagnostic vowel from the other forms of this verb, so it is a patak. And still, there is a heroic yod in between the second and third letter, making this participle very easy to recognize. Just a reminder of our preformatives for the participle in other stems. The Hiphil has a nun with a hirik. The PL has a mem with a vocal schwa. The PUL has a mem with a vocal schwa. And the Hiphil has a mem with a patak. Thus, you can tell the difference between the participles in all the forms. Here is the complete paradigm for the Hiphil. Again, you'll notice the presence of the he plus the hirik in the perfect. And then in all other forms, we have the patak under the first letter. In the imperative, the infinitive construct, and the infinitive absolute have a he. The participle, of course, has a mem. The imperfect is the only one not having a consonant preformative, but taking the preformatives of the imperfect. But still, we have a patak under the preformative consonant, and the hirik yod diagnostic in between the second and third letter, or in some forms, a sere. Once again, gutturals make our life difficult. Although they only make our life difficult in the Hiphil, in the perfect stem, where instead of having a hirik underneath the he, we have a segol, having been drawn from the compound schwa that follows. We still have our hirik yod in between the second and third letters, or we occasionally have that patak under the second root letter, but still the he plus the I class vowel gives away that this is a perfect Hiphil. In all other forms, we maintain the patak under the preformative. There is little change between the third chet and third ayin verbs and the normal strong verb in the Hiphil. The one exception is the placement of a furtive patak on that final guttural, as you can see here in the perfect, the imperfect, infinitive construct, absolute, and participle, where the chet has that furtive patak underneath. The rest of the verb form stays the same. Third aleph verbs also do not change much, except that they quiesce when necessary. In the perfect, this results in a sere instead of a patak under the second root letter, but for the most part, the form stays completely the same. Third he verbs also do not change much. The only difference really is that the he takes their own particular vowel, a kametz in the perfect, a segol in the imperfect, a sere in the imperative, holam vav tav in the construct, and of course the segol in the participle. This will trump the hirik yod or the patak of the Hiphil, but we still know it's a Hiphil because we still have the he plus the hirik in the perfect, or the patak under the preformative in the other forms. Again, as a repetition, here are the third he diagnostics. Keeping in mind you are going to see this chart in every single stem we cover. Perfect always ends in kametz he. Imperfect always ends in segol he. Imperative always ends in sere he. Infinitive construct always ends in holam vav tav. And the participle always ends in segol he. One nun verbs could cause some problems because of their similarity to the nifal, except if you look at all the forms from imperfect to participle, they do not follow the pattern of the nifal, because the nifal has a hirik in the first preformative, followed by a dagesh forte in the first root letter and a kametz under the first root letter. Whereas you see here, we have a patak under all the preformatives. The only real change is in the perfect, where instead of having a patak under the second root letter, the first root letter has dropped off so that the second root letter looks like the first root letter. It's not, it's still the second root letter, and the nun has assimilated as a dagesh forte into that letter. But this is the only real difficulty between this and the other forms of this verb. At first glance, the Hiphil and the nifal look the same, as you see that the yod has changed back to its historical form, which is a vav. However, in the imperfect through the participle in the nifal, vav acts as a full consonant, whereas here you can see in the Hiphil that it acts as a holam vav, a vowel. In the perfect, in the nifal, holam vav is the form as well, except that there is a nun preformative because we're in the nifal. So instead of hoshavta, the bottom form here of the perfect, we have no shavta, with a nun instead of a he. So we're still able to differentiate between the Hiphil and the nifal based on the behavior of that vav. If it acts like a consonant with a kametz, it is a nifal. If it acts like a holam vav, like a vowel, then it is a Hiphil. Bicontinental stems can somewhat be a pain, except for the fact that they will take the hirik yod, or a sere, in all forms. As you can see in the imperfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, and infinitive absolute, instead of having a hirik or a patak, these verbs have a kametz, which makes them look like they could be nifal, but they are not because we have the presence of the hey at the beginning and the heroic yod in between the second and the third vowel. Here is the full paradigm for the Hiphil stem, both the strong and weak verbs. Again, these are changes that we have already learned in other stems. Now we're simply applying them to the Hiphil stem. Well, that's the end. Hopefully you've mastered this information. Use Quizlet to reinforce what you have learned. Remember, in the Hiphil, the key is the heroic yod in between the second and third root letters, and the presence of a hey at the beginning or a patak underneath the preformative. Learn your vocab, and I will see you in class.